Welcome to the latest podcast in a series from the Internationalist and the ANA. I'm Brendan Banaham, Managing Director of the Internationalist Group of Companies. We focus on the reinvention of marketing by connecting the people and ideas in international marketing through content, insights, thought leadership, community collaboration, and consulting. Today's podcast shares how people in our global community are not merely handling today's pandemic crisis, but helping us all to better navigate it. The ability to inspire people to be their best is valuable in difficult times, and no one does this better than marketers. I'll now turn the podcast over to Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist.
Thanks, Brendan, and welcome to another Internationalist Trendsetters show. Jonathan Barnard and Brian Wieser have been in the business of advertising forecasting, intelligence, and trend watching for an exceptionally long time. Given their experience through numerous economic swings and business precedents, few are more likely to aptly guide the industry after a year like 2020. Jonathan joins us from London, while Brian joins us from Portland. And despite the number of time zones in between, they agree on potential outcomes for several macro issues, but often differ somewhat on a variety of specific industry concerns going forward. Jonathan, Brian, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to be hosting both of you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for me as well.
All right, excellent. And what I love about this is we're bridging all parts of the world, or several parts of the world. So, Jonathan, you're in London, and
That's right.
and Brian, you are on the West Coast in Portland, and I'm somewhere in the middle, on the East Coast of the U.S. So this is wonderful. I don't think we have to necessarily talk about how difficult a year 2020 was, but let me, since this is about forecasting, let me start with something just to get the conversation going. It might be a little bit of a naive question, but I think it's a fair one just to get us going. Would you both talk a little bit about the value of forecasting now, particularly as we leave behind a year like 2020, which certainly has changed the baseline? Jonathan, I see you nodding. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I don't think it's a naive question at all. I think it depends. Yeah, I mean, I've got a particular view about what our forecasting provides, which may be quite different from what people might expect. You might naively expect me to be saying, you know, we have a forecast of a particular figure for next year, and that's what we definitely think next year will turn out to be. Whereas I have a rather different opinion. I think our forecasts that we produce collaboratively with our offices from all over the world are a collective opinion of where we think the market stands now and where we think the market is heading, given what we know at the moment. But as this year has clearly proved, but we knew anyway, the world is a very uncertain place. At any moment, things can happen to derail your forecasts. And I don't think that makes our forecast wrong. It just means that we have to update our forecasts given the new information. So I think the forecasts are a good temperature gauge for the market at this point, and an indication of where we as a market participant think the market's headed. But I don't think it's definitely a set in stone prediction that X is going to be the case a year down the line.
And Brian, would you agree with that, or that the forecasting is a bit of a temperature gauge, or do you see it somehow differently in terms of how marketers might use a forecast?
Oh, I'd agree with everything Jonathan said. Although, as you know, my predecessor when I was at Interpublic, Bob Collin, who really invented.
Oh yes, of course, decades.
As he said, forecast early, forecast often. Just the data is never going to be correct. That's the one thing you can be sure about. And so, one thing I learned as a securities analyst when I started, at Deutsche Bank in 2002 doing that work, I was taught that research is an invitation for a conversation. And I think it's the idea that the work that we do requires us to dig into the data to such a depth that, well, let's keep in mind, a model is nothing more than an abstraction of reality. We're trying to take the things that we see, and we're trying to, it's like art in a sense. We're trying to replicate what we see in the world in numbers. And it's an abstraction of the world in a model. So it's no differently than Pablo Picasso didn't paint people as they were, but he was trying to represent them. And the same way that now, I mean, I'd like to think our models aren't abstract art necessarily, but we're trying to emphasize certain things and provide a lens through which to observe the world, and a starting point for a conversation about what's going on.
Well, let's hope that 2021 it might be a little less cubistic, if we can even go that way. But before we get there, let me ask you both: what were some of the surprises that you saw in 2020? And I don't mean the obvious. I mean, were there certain growth areas despite the pandemic? Was there a certain resilience that you didn't anticipate? Was there something, a good surprise that came out of 2020?
Yeah, well, I started off, I think, I guess a particular big surprise was the massive growth in digital spending by small companies.
Interesting.
I mean, you might have assumed that small companies would be worst hit as consumer spending stopped or massively shifted between sectors, and therefore, without all the capital to back them up, would close and stop advertising simply to maintain cash flow. But that's absolutely not what happened at all. These companies realized that in order to survive, they needed to very swiftly retool their businesses to be able to reach out to their existing customers and perhaps even gain new ones through e-commerce electronically. And that has meant advertising digitally using the self-service tools that platforms like Google and Facebook offer them. And businesses in their millions did this and started spending not huge sums individually, but collectively, heavily bolstering spending in digital advertising, which was not something I'd really thought about before we went into this situation. But makes complete sense when you consider that these companies are fighting for their survival.
Yes, and what size were they, would you say, on average? When you say small companies, are they individual retailers, or were they restaurants? Were they companies that were small retailers with 5 stores? Or
I think all of these. I think everyone from your local restaurant to your mom and pop stores to the companies with maybe 4 or 5 stores across a region, which maybe hadn't invested previously in digital advertising. All of them were suddenly faced with the same reality, and made the most of the situation they found themselves in.
Well, let's hope that they all survive and they thrive in the coming year. Brian, did you find that, or was there something else positive that popped out at you in 2020? Yeah,
well, I'd agree that was probably the single biggest surprise, certainly the early pandemic. I'd add that unfortunately and a bit paradoxically, I don't think it's necessarily a mark of a good circumstance, because I think many of the businesses that did it was that, or something is better than nothing. And you could argue that hibernation policies, which some countries enacted better than others, might have been better for the long run. There's still some risk that these businesses that did make those quick pivots are in a much worse position than they were before. And, again, many will not survive, unfortunately. Larger businesses are taking a greater share of economic activity. And so it's really hard to see it in the numbers, though. But, I certainly point to Shopify as a wonderful company to see trends like these in. And I'm not saying they're going to struggle by any stretch. But I am saying that, I'm not sure. I mean, small businesses are much worse off out of this whole period of time. The bigger surprise for me, certainly in our December revisions, relate to the differences between means and medians. And, I don't know, Jonathan, if you saw this, but our numbers in June showed a mean expectation for around 11% decline this year and a median of about 12 decline. The revisions showed a median decline of 11, meaning an improvement, but the mean of 6 down, meaning we saw a much greater improvement in a small number of markets in terms of as the year progressed. Like it could have been so much worse if the world had played out as we expected earlier in the year. And it didn't, at least on average, on a weighted average. And that mean median difference is largely explained by China, the US, and the UK in our numbers, where some of these trends that we just talked about, I think, had the most significant impact, both e-commerce and the overlapping trends, certainly for large and small businesses, but the small businesses are clearly part of that too.
That is interesting, and it's always positive when things look a bit improved. I worry about the markets that are not part of those big three indicators.
I'm cautious about saying improved. It's less terrible.
Or less, yes. Well, it was an improvement over the original number, but yes, no, you're right, and I think we have to always be sensitive about that. Well, speaking of sensitive, the coming year, of course, is interesting because there's certainly greater hope. Yet, I'm assuming we're going to see a continuation of the restrictions. Obviously, how we work, how we've consumed media has all changed. So it's got to be a complicated year to forecast, given a lot of this odd balance of both economic reality and maybe pent-up demand in some cases. So before we get to a deeper discussion of that, is there one word or maybe a phrase that you believe will characterize the coming year, 2021?
So I think we'll see that there's no turning back the clock. That while we can expect most behaviours as the year continues to go towards what they were like before the pandemic, certain things have happened, certain lessons have been learned, which mean that things aren't going to be the same as they were previously. So, for example, businesses are learning that they don't need, or many types of businesses are learning they don't need their employees in the office all the time, and that business can be conducted remotely in ways which don't involve huge expenditure on business travel, time wasted in airports, in taxis, in hotels, and people are finding that they can do things remotely that they thought they had to do in person, and people are going to remain reluctant to socialise as much as they did previously, to travel in public as much as they did previously, and this is going to have, I think, very large effects on distribution of business and consumer spending across different categories, and that these effects are going to take a long time to play out. Mm-hmm. So they may not be immediately obvious, particularly because the government has been, well, various different governments, different countries have tried ways of supporting businesses as they are, and keeping employees in the jobs that they're currently in, which has meant that the market has not had to adapt to these sort of shifts in consumer and business demand that would have had a huge effect this year. But over time, these adaptations are going to have to be made. And I think that although as vaccines roll out and consumers start to feel that life is returning to normal, that in the long term, we are going to see a big effect on how different categories find their way to consumers, how they market, how they communicate, and the distribution of money between different categories. So, and I think that's going to play out over the course of the whole of next year and beyond.
That's interesting. So if we were to take a phrase from that, would it be not the same, no turning back, lessons learned, or
yeah. I mean,
any one of those, huh?
No turning back, no turning back.
No turning back, no turning back. All right. Quite definitive. Brian, how would you characterize, just very quickly, 2021?
Well, I sometimes I wish I spoke German, because then I could take a compound and turn it into a single one, right?
Yeah. Well, we could do a phrase. We can do a phrase.
It's resilience. I mean, at the end of the day, given how bad things are when it comes to advertising, I mean, it's in media, it's resilient, because we are seeing the world's largest marketers finding ways to adapt wherever possible. And even if conditions are going to be weak in the first part of the year on a relative basis, I mean, clarify, the second quarter will be pretty spectacular if you look at the growth rates. But of course, I could double my salary next year if I cut it in half this year.
Yes.
So it's like just saying it'll grow, we'll see great growth. The second quarter doesn't necessarily mean anything. But resilience meaning that, the world has figured out, most of the world's figured out and been able to find ways to proceed.
Yes, 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 the Great Reckoning. Yes. Well, we started talking about some countries before. So let's just, are there certain countries that you're watching, either because they've been hit hard by the pandemic or because you think they're a bellwether for recovery?
Do you want to start on this one, Brian? I don't want to jump in front of you all the time. So
No. I mean, it's, the thing that struck me about this year, and I think next year as well, is that the lack of a correlation between economic activity and advertising activity in this year, and therefore also in next year, is really quite striking. Now, you could argue the right way to look at the data is never to look at it inside of a year and across markets, but only ever to look at it across markets. Across years within a given market, meaning you compare Germany from 1990 or 2000 to 2020, but don't compare Germany and UK and France and Spain and Brazil and et cetera in the same year. I kind of think this is such an odd year where you kind of need to be able to look at, well, how did a change in economic activity or scale the impact of the pandemic, if depending on which dimension you want to quantify it with, how did that relate to advertising? I haven't really found that connection yet. And so when we think about how that plays out next year, I mean, next year you get the challenge of both recovery, whatever that means for a given country, largely impacted by whatever hibernation policies were put in place, paired with what are almost everywhere easy comparables. And so it's really hard. It's really hard to point to any one kind of benchmark country that tells us something about, there is no.
No, I think you raise a very interesting point about the economy and advertising and that correlation, and it's something to be looked at.
Can I add something we just discovered that was interesting and maybe explain some of this a bit? We decided to look at, and again, on our data, which might be different than how others will see it, we correlated economic activity in London specifically over the last 20 years with advertising in the UK broadly, and found London's GDP does a better job of explaining UK advertising than UK GDP does in explaining UK advertising. And it was more of a symptomatic thing that sometimes the world in which our industry inhabits, both on the agency side and the marketer side, can explain activities and spending patterns better than what's actually going on. And that's not just a UK specific comment, that's a universal thing. So I can't help but think that would be a more pronounced problem or issue in a year like this one or next one.
Yeah, and I think given London's power, particularly in advertising, that probably has broader implications to many countries, even throughout Europe. Given that London is such a center for advertising, both for the UK and as a hub, as a multinational hub. Are you finding something like that, Jonathan, or are you actually looking at some particular countries as bellwethers?
No, I agree with Brian here. I think if you have a look at, even looking at in Europe, there's been a very wide disparity in outcomes, despite a very similar reaction to economic reaction and similar levels of infections and responses to those. Look at France, for example. It had possibly the worst Q2 in the world, and a very, very tough year across and then compare that to Italy and Spain, which suffered much more in terms of infections and an immediate economic impact, but actually the advertising spend was did terribly, but not nearly as terribly as France. And similar picture for the UK. And you look at the US, which is obviously the pattern across different parts of the year is rather different, but the overall economic outcomes and the effects of the pandemic have been broadly similar, but what happened to advertising is absolutely different. So then you look in Asia, some markets, looking at one, South Korea, for example, is held up relatively well, thanks to controlling the coronavirus. But then New Zealand did spectacularly well in controlling the virus, and the advertising market has not had a good year at all.
That's interesting. That is quite interesting,
right?
Yeah,
very few. It's really hard to point to the correlations. The Japanese economy is worse than South Korea's, but not enough to explain the difference of advertising outcomes that you see between those two markets.
Well, no one's mentioned China yet.
It's been helping.
And India, there was some statistics that came out on India today, and that seems to be a bit worrying.
We think China seemed to essentially shrugged off the blow at the start of the year in a way that no other market has managed. And yes, in India, we think, it has suffered a lot more, and the damage to the ad market is ongoing.
And perhaps even to the economy. In a dramatic way. Yes. Yeah. Well, let's go now from markets to some media specifics. There's no surprise that digital will, of course, continue to grow. Now, so what does this actually mean for advertisers, beyond shifting more expenditure to digital media? Is this largely fueled by e-commerce? Do advertisers have to think differently about their messaging? Is it all about performance marketing rather than brand building? Can you unpack that a little bit in terms of media going forward?
Who should go first?
I'll go if you want. It's a big shift. And obviously e-commerce is a big driver behind this. I don't think it's the only driver. We've seen under the ongoing shift of media consumption from offline to online media. Consumers are spending so much more time with information and entertainment content online. We've seen very heavy growth in SVOD services this year, which of course is locking off audiences from advertisers, but also advertiser-funded video on demand, other types of online video. We're seeing more competition among the social media platforms. So it's not just Facebook and Instagram anymore. We've seen the rise of TikTok, Snapchat, providing, they're providing more audiences and more competition for audiences and for advertisers. So we're seeing new environments, different environments, and advertisers are having to use these environments for branding as well as for performance, because audiences on traditional television and in places like in newspapers and magazines are, well, either falling or disappearing, depending on which media you're looking at. So branding is always going to be necessary for some brands more than others, but it's a vital component of marketing. And will remain so. And in order to reach some types of audiences, you have to do it online now.
Yeah, well, I yes, absolutely.
And I think the big situation that brands are facing is that the great advantage of digital advertising is targeting and personalization, and that's becoming much more difficult as the third-party cookie gradually disappears, which risks entrenching the power of the big walled gardens, which are able to provide targeting and personalization within their own content, but lock off the ability to do that with it across different platforms and third-party publishers as well. So that's going to be a challenge for digital.
At least when their services aren't failing to work.
Oh, exactly. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it's been quite a week. Yes.
Which was a big issue for publicists on Monday. I assume you saw.
Well, Brian, what do you think? Obviously, there's only continued migration to digital, no matter what. But the story has to be bigger than that.
Well, I think that the biggest story, sometimes missed or misinterpreted, is that, our data, at least, and Jonathan, I think yours is, and I think Magna's is, if I can say Magna's is, my history there, but it's really meant to track media owners' ad revenues. And I think sometimes marketers look at the data and think that this data is a composite of all marketers' activities, and they misinterpret how important large brands are in context of the world. Therefore, they assume, well, the typical advertiser is spending money this way. Now, first of all, the first application I always make to marketer is ignore the work that I do. Ignore everything I might say, including what I'm saying right now. And start by trying to understand what your own business goals are, and start by trying to figure out how to drive your resources into supporting your business through marketing-led strategies. And then, media is ultimately more of a tactic to support those goals. But anyways, put that aside. The data itself is a composite of media owners' ad revenues. And that means that if media owners' ad revenues are increasingly dependent on smaller businesses, that's not what marketers should be benchmarking themselves against. And so we have to remember that some significant element of the share increase that's gone to digital is due to the inclusion of spending from smaller businesses that are digital. And again, keep in mind what we don't include, like in our globally consistent data sets, none of us are including directories and direct mail, which skews the numbers in a certain way, in a digital way too, right? I mean, obviously directories have been diminishing and largely been replaced by digital. So, but if you exclude the number that's going way down, and it was print, but you only include the number that's going up, digital. And there's good reasons why we don't include it in these data sets. But it's really important not to say, we're going to benchmark ourselves against these averages as a marketer. To that, I also say, hey, marketer, if you're looking at the averages and you're benchmarking yourself to the average, do you want to be average? Do you? Really? No, you don't want to be average. Ignore this data. Start with your own strategies first, and then use this to understand how media owners collectively are performing.
Yeah, that is interesting. Kind of an inside-out approach. Well, speaking just specifically of some media, and Jonathan, you mentioned new social platforms. TikTok is among the brands that gained the greatest awareness in 2020. I think the statistics I've seen, it's TikTok and Zoom varying in first and second place. So, Jonathan, we'll start with you. What do you see ahead for TikTok, or maybe more importantly, their format?
Well, I'm possibly not the best person to be speaking about this. I mean, maybe you should be asking my 11-year-old daughter, who knows much more about TikTok than I do. But it is really very quickly managed to capture the attention of a lot of people in a very engaging way, and I think is only really starting to scratch the surface of how it can be monetized, and brands are only starting to think about how they can take advantage of this new way of communicating with a great audience.
And sometimes it's purely accidental. I think, as we saw with Ocean Spray or something like that. Yeah.
So I think it's got a huge amount of untapped potential, and it could well, it could spawn a legion of imitators. It probably will. Whether any of them will do it quite as well as it does remains to be seen. But I'm not clear myself quite how it's going to pan out.
Particularly since not everyone in short format video has been successful.
No, well, very few have been. Mm-hmm. And there have been, we look at Vines, look at Quibi, or however you're supposed to pronounce it. Mm-hmm. TikTok has been very unusual in making such a success of it. I think in the way that it manages to lead its users in a sort of journey of content from one to another through its algorithmic approach. It's a very successful way of doing that. I don't have any answers as to how it's going to evolve. All I can say is I'm going to follow it with very great interest.
Mm-hmm. And you, Brian?
TikTok is. I would argue is much more in the news in our world because of certainly what the U.S. government was in the geopolitical considerations. We have to keep the context in mind of the company. Now, ByteDance is a much bigger player in China, obviously, than as a parent company. In some ways, more important to the global numbers, even though it is so heavily concentrated there. But TikTok itself, we have to remember, it's kind of small. That doesn't mean not interesting, not important and useful for many marketers as a place to, make the most of. But, it's in a tier that's solidly, it's Pinterest, it's Twitter, it's Snap. There's nothing yet to indicate that it's, a platform that's likely in the next tier of, Amazon, let alone the tier of Facebook and Google. So it's helpful, I guess, is a good way to think about it. Helpful for the market to demonstrate that it's possible to produce, new players. Because I think every marketer, large ones certainly, want to have the ability to, distribute their spending a little more broadly and not feel like they have to spend it with Facebook and Google, at least among larger brands. And so it's healthy for the ecosystem to see the emergence of another platform, and I'm sure we'll see others that will come in over time.
No, interesting. Let me ask you about one other sector, and then we'll get to some summing up. But we touched on this a little bit, kind of obliquely, just a few minutes ago when we talked about the cookie going away, the third-party cookie and first-party data. So I'm actually intrigued by the fast growth of retail media, which obviously can take advantage of first-party data. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or why it's important in the scheme of the ecosystem, or what you see ahead for it?
I mean, retail media is kind of like point of sale advertising in shops, or advertising displays in shops. It's reaches consumers at the point where they're making their purchase decision. Reminds them of times they've previously seen the brand referenced, nudges them in the right direction, and therefore is treated by many brands in a very different way from normal advertising. In fact, it's not treated by many companies as a form of advertising at all, but really it's treated as part of their commercial function of when they have to try to get shelf space in supermarkets. They will go and talk to the supermarkets and reach deals about where their products appear and any displays that appear around them, and there are very, very large sums of money devoted to this. And this is going from bricks and mortar shops onto the web, and is coming into the ambit of advertising, which is great for us because it means there's a huge amount of untapped money, which is suddenly becoming part of our business. It's not really changing fundamentally what brands do when they negotiate with retailers, but it's making a great amount of advertising inventory available at the point where consumers are making that purchase decision, and it allows brands and their agencies to use the tools they've created for other forms of digital advertising to optimize, to target and personalize and use much more intelligently and in a data-backed way than the traditional in-store displays could ever be used.
Yeah, and I'm thinking more about this move that we're seeing, with companies like Target and their division. It's Roundel. Also, I think we've had an announcement that Walgreens Boots is going to come up with some of their own media forms of direct communications with customers. And I'm not sure what that means, but I'm assuming that brands that want distribution with those retailers will certainly put a fair amount of money, just as some of them might be putting a fair amount of money into Amazon.
Keep in mind the difference between Amazon and almost everybody else is the scale that Amazon's operating at online. So I think the aspirations are there to build their sales businesses into something much bigger. To the extent that this is the revenue is driven not as much by in-store activity and much more by online activity. It's not to say that these retailers can't produce profitable initiatives in this space, but the scale of impact is just going to be continually dwarfed by Amazon because it's still, it's so much bigger as a place for people to go shopping. The other thing to keep in mind as well with respect to to Amazon in particular, and I think it's the lure of Amazon that's really, and the ad revenues they're seeing, which drives a lot of the investment by retailers in these networks, is that so much of the revenue that that Amazon is seeing from advertising probably comes from the marketplaces as well. That's one piece where, and you've got, I think I saw some data for Europe that it's something like half of the marketplace sales comes from China. Primarily, and to the extent that it is manufacturers based in other markets selling on a broadly reaching marketplace use advertising to drive their results up. It just get more sales ultimately. I don't know that that's going to be as applicable to other retailers unless they mimic the marketplace. And even then, it's kind of hard if you're, number 2 or number 3 by a wide distance as a marketplace provider. The other thing with respect to retail related advertising is ultimately this issue that it is tied ultimately to sales for many many marketers.
Yeah, which is wonder, and you did talk about them, marketers wanting to distribute some of their spending. So I thought that was rather, an interesting thing. Okay, well, finally, last question, unless there's anything else you'd like to add. When do you expect ad spending to reach or surpass pre-pandemic levels?
Our figure is 2022. Which is pretty good considering how much of a hit so many markets are taking this year. That's our consensus across all the markets looked at. I mean, some regions are going to take longer to recover, some are going to take less. So we think, for example, Eastern Europe and Asia Pacific are going to be back to their pre-pandemic levels this year. Western Europe's going to take until 23. And God knows what's going to happen with the Middle East. But the spending has bounced back quickly enough from the depths it reached in Q2, and in some markets we've already seen year-on-year growth in some months in 2020. So that's compared to 2019 baseline. 2021 is obviously, barring a huge catastrophe, going to be better than 2020, particularly Q2, as we've discussed. We expect the recovery to continue in 22 onwards. So that's the figure we.
It'll be here before we know it. Do you agree with that timeline, Brian?
Actually, our numbers are faster than that. In our June forecast, we would have agreed with that, but I think we're generally expecting a more robust 2021 than we previously expected, and pretty well everywhere. I agree. Middle East won't, but pretty well everywhere. Every other region certainly will see 2021 exceeding 2019 levels. And because of the factors we've been talking about.
Well, that is a very optimistic note to end on.
I mean, let's be clear. Like I said before, cut your salary in half, you could double it next year.
Right. Well, let's.
Where we were in 2019 isn't by itself necessarily a good thing.
Well, let's hope we don't have to do that, or perhaps we're more prepared for the next pandemic to come along. But I hope that you'll join us again in 2021 to talk a little bit more about how these trends are moving forward, and if there's other things that you see on the horizon. So thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm sure that our marketer audience will very much appreciate both of your insights. Thanks, Jonathan and Brian, for being a part of today's show and for playing an essential role in our business. Now, back to Brendan.
And that concludes today's podcast. Thanks again for listening. For more information on The Internationalist, please go to our website, www.theinternationalist.com. By the way, there's a hyphen between the and Internationalist. That's where you'll find more information on podcasts and interviews, as well as highlights of our various initiatives, including Marketing Makes a World of Difference, Internationalist Insights and Studies and Intelligence Briefs, awards and case studies and best practices, peer-to-peer marketing think tanks and forums, and the Internationalist Press. The ability to inspire people to be their best selves is valuable in difficult times. We feel very strongly about the fact that no one does this better than marketers.